Hello, everybody. I want to say good morning, everybody, because actually, though you don't know this, it's morning it's a Sunday morning in Massachusetts and California and Maryland. And this is Charlie Swenson, and this is the podcast To Hell and Back. And I want to say a preliminary thing, just what this topic is today, with my guests, Amara, Brooke, and Rachel Kraus, both of whom have been with me for 2 podcasts, and Rachel for 3, or maybe Rachel's been with 1, and Amara's been with 3. And we've been talking about autism and adaptations of DBT to autism. What's the intersection between DBT and treating autistic folks that are in DBT? And we've looked at it from several angles, and today we're going to look at it very, very specifically from when you teach skills. Since DBT's skills are sort of at the center of what is thought to be the change agent in DBT, the agent that helps people regulate emotions better, which then changes lots of things. So that's true also for autistic folks, but with autistic folks, you have to adapt to the fact that they have a certain neurotype, autism. And DBT's been all about adapting ever since Linehan started it. It was adapted to addictions. And that included adapting the skills to people with addictions because they have certain lifestyles and they encounter certain challenges with their addictions. And then I adapted it quickly to inpatient treatment. That required adapting skills. We had to add some skills like how to be empathic in responding to fellow patients on the unit in certain group meetings, how to leave meetings angrily but without hurting anybody or doing yourself in, all kinds of skills that we added on, and we teach skills with an eye to somebody's in an inpatient setting. This is about teaching skills to people with an eye to the fact that they have an autism neurotype. And as we went over in a previous podcast, and there's, like I said, there's 3 available if you want to go back to listen to them. You're not trying to change autism by, your goal isn't to target autism and change autism, which is one common misunderstanding in the DBT world. Autism is a neurotype, so we're not trying to change that. That's a built-in part of the nervous system. It's a way of thinking. It's a way the brain works. We're trying to help people with autism achieve their goals in life and regulate their emotions, which are the big goals of DBT for everybody, right? So what do you have to do when you teach skills? Now, my guests are experts from several angles on the topic. Amara, Brooke is a clinical psychologist in Silicon Valley area, the Bay Area, the San Francisco area, and she's been doing DBT for many years. And she's a clinical psychologist who also does testing, and she does psychotherapy with other models as well. And she has a subspecialty working with people with autistic neurotypes and ADHD. And she herself has acknowledged in the previous podcast that she has autism and ADHD. So she knows this from the inside as well. Same with Rachel Kraus, who's from the Baltimore area, and she's a clinical social worker and psychotherapist and DBT therapist and DBT teacher and other models of treatment as well. And she also focuses a lot on autism and ADHD. And she also has acknowledged that she herself has autism and ADHD. So we're rich with resources here, and we've got to just try to channel them into, these are 2 people who know what it's like both to give and receive DBT skills with autism. And so I'm going to be basically the moderator. We're going to go through a bunch of topics like, what about this about autism? What about this feature of autism? What about this way of being autistic? What are the implications for how do you teach skills? We're not going to be able to be totally comprehensive and cover how do you redo every skill and every worksheet and every handout and every mindfulness exercise, all of which would be valuable if that's what you're doing. But we can't do that. It's just a matter of observing our own personal limits, time limits here. So we're going to hit on some things, that these guys have found to be helpful. And we know that we're not going to hit on everything. Feel free to write me through my website or leave messages on ratings and reviews on wherever you listen to podcasts. And then I can get these questions and comments, and I can also get them to Amara and Rachel. So Amara and Rachel, welcome. Good to see you.
Thank you, Charlie. It's great to be back. Thanks for having us.
Yeah, thank you, Charlie.
Thanks for being willing to jump in on a Sunday morning. All right, so there's going to be several themes, you might say, or features that a DBT therapist will encounter in working with an autistic individual, or a group of autistic individuals. So we're going to start with one, and I actually don't know which of my guests is going to take on which topic, or whether they're going to share them, but that's up to them. So the first topic is, let's call it the topic of invisibility, is that you're treating somebody with DBT, and from your point of view, their autism is invisible. They have spent their life learning how to hide it, mask it, not have it show up because it's stigmatized or because they've been mistreated in the past, they've been invalidated. And so masking is a big deal, which we're going to come back to. And so what do you do with how do you deal with the problem of invisibility? Do you screen people for autism? How do you check on that? Or how do you wake up to the fact that somebody has autistic features? So I'm going to hand this over to whoever's going to take it from here.
So this is Amara. I will hop in first. Thank you so much, Charlie, for hosting us doing this topic. So as far as, figuring out, am I working with an autistic person? I think that's just a question that, isn't on the mind of a lot of DBT therapists when they start a therapy process. I think most people are, most of us start with some sort of maybe screening questionnaires, maybe just a clinical interview. And, usually we're looking for things like personality differences, trauma history, anxiety, depression, suicidal thoughts and behaviors, self-harming thoughts and behaviors. Those are all things that are on our radar screen. But in many cases, autism and or ADHD may not be on our radar screen unless the client already has one of those diagnoses and has told us about it. So I'm just going to suggest at the beginning, because autistic clients, first of all, there are a lot of adults who don't even know that they're autistic. A lot of folks who, because of differences in diagnosis, didn't get diagnosed when they were children. People may not even know. So I would suggest a couple of things. One is, if you do screening questionnaires before you start treatment, some people will do things like a PHQ-9 or a GAD-7, or maybe, difficulties in emotion regulation scale, a borderline symptom list, or just various kinds of screeners. You might add some quick things that would look at the possibility of potential autism or ADHD. There's a really quick 7-item questionnaire, the ASSERT, which I find convenient to throw in kind of a screening questionnaire packet. There's some longer things like the autism quotient, or the RADS-R, which are kind of longer, more thorough screeners for autism. There's the ASRS for ADHD, which is not perfect, but widely available and fairly brief. So if you're already doing kind of screening questionnaires at the beginning, that's kind of an easy way to throw in some questions that might, help raise your awareness that you may have an autistic or ADHD individual in treatment with you. There are many questionnaires available on a website called embrace-autism.com. So if you're not quite sure where to find these questionnaires, that would be a place. And the ones that I mentioned are all freely available. They're not ones that you have to pay for each administration or anything like that. Many therapists are already using electronic means like psych surveys or things like that to collect outcome measures. And that might be another way that you could do initial screening questionnaires if you're trying to figure out the nuts and bolts of administration, which I know is something that my detailed brain always gets a little bit hung up on. And then in terms of once they're actually in your office, I I would say, really, because the people may come in the office being a little guarded, being a little hesitant with a new therapist, and that could be true for any client, especially also traumatized clients, but just really inviting openness, being open and curious, and asking questions that might, give you a hint whether, somebody has an autistic or ADHD neurotype. And I'm just going to throw out some ideas here, but certainly don't limit yourself to these things. Questions like, have you had any social or communication differences in your life? Any differences in how you respond to other people or in how other people respond to you in ways that are kind of confusing? Like, I don't know, like, why did they take offense to that thing that I said? Or, why are they upset with me? I don't even know. Any differences in sort of like, do you ever have trouble kind of picking up on like nonverbal signals that other people say that they're sending? And they're like, how did you not know that I was, thinking or feeling that? And you're like, I don't know, like, I'm not even sure what I missed, right? Or does it seem like other people project things onto you? And you're like, why do you think I'm angry? I don't know that I'm angry, or I don't think I'm angry, right? Is there any differences in kind of, back and forth in terms of nonverbal signaling in your life? Any differences in relationships, like, having difficulty, starting relationships with people, or figuring out like, what are the things I need to do to maintain a relationship? Like, I'm not really sure even what's involved with that, or needing more time to myself than other people do. And do you ever get flack from other people for, not being as available to them as they would wish that you were? I mean, obviously, these are things that don't only apply to autistic people, but these are things that, a lot of autistic people would have, some experience with. In terms of the other, so that those questions all kind of speak to the social communication differences, kind of part of autism. There's also what we call the sort of like repetitive behaviors aspect, which I think is a poor term, but asking things like, are there any behaviors that you do, or sounds that you make, or things that you look at, or anything that are soothing to you that you kind of do over and over again, and that you find to be like helpful when you're upset or when you're overwhelmed, or things like that. How is it for you coping with change, especially if it's unexpected, if somebody kind of asks you to do something unexpected or changes a plan, at the last minute? Like, is that, about, I mean, of course it's a little hard for everybody, but is that harder for you than for other people? Do people ever give you a hard time about needing more, structure than other people do, or needing more of a heads up? Are there, things that you love that you like to spend lots of time doing and or talking about? Do other people ever like tease you about having such, strong interests and passions, and, maybe even a little jealousy that you are more interested in that than you are in them, or, things like that, right? Have you ever had an experience like that? Do you have sensory differences, like anything that really bothers you in terms of sight, smell, sounds, touch, like motion, that maybe doesn't bother, that other people have commented that doesn't bother them, and what's wrong with you that it bothers you? Are there, any things that, sensory things where you need more sensory input, like where you really crave, like, movement, spinning, rocking, like any kind of like, or you need like more pressure to feel something, you're somebody who needs the deeper tissue massage, right? Like, are there any things where you need more to be able to like feel like you have enough in terms of like sensory input? And that, so I would say that kind of speaks to, obviously that's not a be all and all of questions related to autism, but just some things on kind of the surface. For ADHD, I would say, just any differences in paying attention, especially to things that aren't very interesting to you, maybe getting sucked down a rabbit hole with things that are interesting to you and not being, able to get out when you need to, feeling restless or having a lot of energy, kind of impulsivity, leaping before you look type of thing. So those are just some like ideas. And the other thing I would say is, don't overvalue your intuition, but do notice if you're kind of like, there's something different about interacting with this person in my office. Like, I'm not sure what it is. I maybe need to reflect on that, but I'm just noticing a little, my spidey senses are kind of like, like I'm just noticing something a little bit different, right? And I'm not saying to be judgy about it, but just notice that experience of being kind of in the room or on the Zoom with, the person, and like, what do you notice, so that's about, I'm going to stop there because I know we only have so much time. And I wanted to hand it over to Rachel to talk about other things to be mindful of at the beginning of treatment, to try to notice whether you might, have an autistic or ADHD client in treatment with you.
Thanks, Amara.
Of course.
You covered a lot of the stuff that I was going to talk a little bit about, but I just kind of wanted to add a little bit. Sometimes autistic and or ADHD or ADHD, which is that combination of traits where you can actually qualify for both neurotypes. Sometimes we don't know that we have them because of the genetic component, and we grow up in these families, and this interaction is seen as our normal. This is our parents. Oh, that's hard for you? Well, that's hard for me too, just because they don't. So, Amara, what you were saying about having somebody in your office feeling something a little different, and if you are an ADHD, an ADHD, an autistic clinician, also finding that there's some similarities. You feel more comfortable working with this client, even if they're not identifying it in themselves. But I take a more utilitarian approach after a diagnostic and doing like a sensory profile with all my clients, as well as a learning style assessment. Just so I can be teaching them skills in a way that they best learn. And, using, are you a visual learner? Are you an auditory learner? And then with sensory profiles, it's number one, we don't know what we don't know. If somebody's ever never asked them, is there something you like to do when you feel dysregulated? And then they say, oh yeah, I watched the same show over and over and over again. That might be some indicator there. And that we're getting to know where our clients are very, very sensitive and where they need more input, because we're just wired differently. So if we're creating groups, that we're not putting people with conflicting sensory needs there, or directly conflicting. And if we are, we're doing it with a problem-solving approach. Nobody's needs are more important than someone else's. They're just different. And that we're taking this into account. These sensory differences, they're going to come up in all of the skills. And we're always kind of keeping it in the back of our mind that this person just is in the world differently. And the last thing I want to talk a little bit about is processing speed, or processing, because autistic clients, my colleague Matt Lowry talks a lot about this hyper-connected brain with so many neurons firing. We refer to it as a delay in processing speed. And one of the ways I explain it to clients is like, you just have so much extra going on there. Like if you have a computer that's you're running a program and you're looking for something in that program, you're looking for a piece of data, it's going to take that much longer for the output if it's running through a whole lot more information. And with a hyper-connected brain, sometimes that's what's going on. So we've got people who are processing internally that we as therapists aren't making an assumption. This person's zoning out. This person's not participating. They're dissociating. They may be, and they may not be. It may be that they're just processing it all. It's going to take them a beat to think. They may not be as adept to, answering right away. And then there's the other side of it, which is people who process externally. So that's what I am. I'm an external processor. If you have a client who's talking and talking and talking in group, and you're like, okay, get to your point, and they may not actually know what their point is because they're literally figuring it out. They're running through all this information in their brain out of their mouth because they can't do it inside their head. And it's really, really high. You have this detailed story. It's hard to prioritize what information to provide and what not. Even writing notes like I have in front of me doesn't feel quite adequate. It can be frustrating if you're interrupting those folks because they're like, I'm getting there. I'm just trying to get there. I'm trying to actually put words to that connection that my brain sees so clearly, right? And that we're accounting for this. And, the last piece of that is that we're really sitting in this neuro humility, this aspect of cultural humility. We don't, making the assumption we don't know what's going on in that person's brain until we can really sit and get curious and aren't passing judgment or assumptions, because that can really do more harm. And that will show up over and over again as well.
Great. Wow. You guys just covered a ton of stuff that I'm glad this is a podcast, because people could listen to it again. And if they wanted to take notes, or if they wanted to get something down or think about something, it's all here. And boy, I can see that this could go on. This one topic could go a long time. Thank you so much. I mean, and I'll just add one little caveat as somebody myself who has worked with some autistic people that I didn't know were autistic when I was first working with them, and that I'm not an expert in it, and that I haven't used those kind of screens. In a way, teaching DBT skills systematically, week by week, skill by skill, is a screening device. Because I've taught skills where somebody actually, I'm in the middle of teaching a skill and I encounter, oh my God, this person has no idea about how to do this, or this person doesn't know how to say no. And there's lots of reasons for that. But what's going on in their head? Or somebody sits in a group facing away from the group, not looking at anybody. And people have various ways to interpret that behavior. But in the person I'm thinking of, she actually was taking everything in, but she didn't want to have to look at the group, and she wore sunglasses and stuff like that. So and there's a million examples of this. I just gave a couple, but I'm thinking of others. But I just want you to know, not all is lost if you didn't do a screening device at the beginning, because you start to, as soon as I thought what Rachel said was so helpful about the intuition, is that you say, oh, wait a minute. And your intuition tells you there's something a little different here, and you can follow up on it. Now, there are other things to say, but I think we need to move on, because I'm the moderator, and I know how many topics we're going to cover. Rachel, I can see you want to say something further. So
Charlie, it's one sentence. That's that very first part of that missing link analysis is, can the client actually do the thing I'm asking them to do? And it sounds like as you're teaching the skills, you really are keeping that in the forefront of, as I'm teaching this, can you actually do it? And that'll show up as we go.
Yeah.
That's all I want to add in.
Okay. So second topic is about it's funny, earlier Amara said something like, she referred to herself and she said, my detail brain. And now detail brain, direct thinking brain, specific brain, logical brain, whatever you call this sort of detail, being direct, being literal, taking things literally, being meant to be taken literally, all of these things that have to do with being literal and specific and detailed and logical and this stuff, which a lot of autistic people bring with their neurotype. What are the implications for skills training with that? Because there's some skills that don't sound very literal, and that are kind of like metaphorical or kind of vague and stuff like that. So I wanted to open the door to, how do you address that? And are there certain skills that are hard to teach because of people's so-called detail brain?
So I'll start speaking to that. And I think I want to say at the beginning of this that, we often say you've met one autistic person, you've met one autistic person. So not all autistic people are the same this way. With this, I'm speaking a bit to my own experience, but I know that a lot of, there are many autistic people who do have a very detailed processing, like Rachel said, kind of hyper connected. There's a lot of stuff going on in there. We're trying to sort of connect everything. And, that there are some folks who have different degrees of ease or difficulty with non-realistic kind of metaphors, I guess. And, obviously a lot of autistic people are extremely creative and create a lot of fantasy worlds and are involved in that kind of thing. And I think it's just important that we don't make an assumption that, every autistic person only has to have things that are 100% literal and realistic, or they can handle any kind of, fantasy stuff. I mean, there's going to be a wide variety, but I'm just kind of speaking here to one thing, which is that with some of the DBT skills, there's a lot of vague language and a lot of things that just don't even, to a literal detailed brain, seem like They're like, it's even obvious how it works. And I have found myself when I teach DBT skills, sometimes getting hung up on that. And I sometimes have clients that get hung up on that. So that's kind of what I'm speaking to here. I just want to say communication is a core difference in autism. And if a client is what we'd say non-speaking, or sometimes people say nonverbal, we obviously would realize that communication is going to be different, right? However, even if a client speaks clearly and eloquently, communication may also be different, right? And this, how we're interpreting things in this sort of detailed, literal, direct communication style is one way that it can be different. So I would say that the issues around sort of vague, I want to use the term woo-woo, although I'm mindful that might not make sense to everybody because it, but there's a lot of this language that comes up in mindfulness, I think most of all, in terms of the DBT skills. So I would just say, for some folks, just beware of language that may be really vague or not literally possible. I'm going to give some examples here just because I know me just saying vague language might also not be clear to people. But just give a disclaimer if there might be unrealistic aspects of the mindfulness exercise or language that's vague. Be prepared to define and entertain and not dismiss questions about vague terms or vague assumptions. Be prepared to explain something in a way that is more straightforward. So I'm just going to throw out some examples. These are, I think, mostly from mindfulness. Or actually, I think this is from the introduction. So there's a reference to emptiness, right? I think a lot of people who don't know clinical terminology might not have any idea what emptiness means. And then it also could be interpreted literally, which is confusing. Willfulness, right? That shows up in the introduction before it's even really been defined. There's from the mindfulness section, experience the reality of your connection to the universe, your essential validity. There's references to the wisdom within each person, to letting yourself fall into the center space between the pauses in your breath, breathing the sounds into your body and letting them flow on your out breath, focusing your attention on the space between your eyes, references to I feel the chair feels me, feeling thankful to an object for being kind to you, et cetera, right? So there's a lot of these things that can be fairly vague that you're like, I don't even know what that means. And that doesn't even seem like literally that could be true. And it just can be really confusing if you do have a very literal, rational kind of, detailed brain. And I'll, disclose that I'm autistic and I come from a family of scientists. And I also have a lot of sort of scientific training. So we tend to probably be far on the end of that, literalness. And there's, as Rachel has pointed out to me, plenty of autistic people who, actually infer a lot of human characteristics to objects or, all kinds of things. So this is not true for every autistic person, but just consider that vague language there's also a lot of mindfulness exercises that have kind of vague language like this. So just when there is something kind of vague, or if a client, who may be autistic, or maybe you don't know they're autistic, but they have issues with I don't really even know what that means, just be aware that that's a valid difference, to see things that way and be prepared to be more specific. To give a few specific examples, so I would say in the worksheets, there's some worksheets that have instructions that are very clear, and there's some that have instructions that can be somewhat ambiguous. So kind of be prepared to clarify if people have concerns about instructions being ambiguous. And, again, a lot of autistic people, I don't think we've said it in this episode yet, but many of us have been the person in class who asked a million questions, and we have gotten flack for asking so many questions and wanting so many specifics and so many details. And that is a completely valid thing to want. And you may not always know every answer, and that's fine. That's part of the neuro humility that Rachel was mentioning, to say, gosh, that's a really interesting way to look at that. Like, I'm not even really sure. Let me give that a little bit of thought, right? That's a sort of humble, like, wow, what an interesting way to look at it. Not that like you're wrong for wanting to ask questions, but I've also seen, not only have had my own experiences with being given a hard time for asking so many questions, but seeing DBT therapists that I've been teaching with kind of pathologize a little bit or give clients a hard time for asking a lot of questions, instead of just kind of accepting that that's what they need and doing your best to meet that need. I wanted to say a few examples. In distress tolerance, I really love the factors that interfere with radical acceptance. It's actually like almost a response to the types of questions that autistic people often ask. I love that it's so specific. The radical acceptance step-by-step is a fantastic addition to the latest manual. I think radical acceptance was a much more vague concept in the original version of the manual, and those both the factors that interfere and the step-by-step are great, clear step-by-step examples of how to do skills. I would say there's other places in the manual that are not yet up to that standard in terms of specificity, but I think those are great examples of how to do that well. I think in distress tolerance, again, half smiling and willing hands is terrific. It's concrete, it's clear how to do it. You can, give examples of a famous painting that looks like that. You can say, like, there's stuff in there about what exactly to do with your face and the muscles around your mouth. Like, I just love that they're very, very specific and concrete skills. I think that's super helpful. I think in emotion regulation, the functions of emotion, I think it's handout 3 is fantastic. It's super logical. It helps make sense of, what feels. Emotions can feel like very unfamiliar and very kind of hard to understand. And I really love that. In checking the facts can be great. It can also be problematic, and Rachel's going to get to that. But you may get questions about, like, what's the threat? There's a question about what's the threat and what's the catastrophe, and it's not super clear in the manual exactly like what a threat versus a catastrophe is. So you might get questions about that. In emotion regulation handout 9, when you're deciding whether to use problem solving or opposite action, there's one, so it's sort of a flow chart for those of you who know that handout. But be prepared to give examples for when there's one situation where the emotion does not fit the facts, but acting on it is effective. And I've seen, I think skills group leaders sometimes find that challenging to explain as well and try to gloss over it. And guess who's going to ask you for an example of that? Not only, but you have an autistic client and group, they're probably going to ask you, because they're going to want to know, like, wait, like, when would that happen? And just kind of hand waving explanations are not necessarily going to feel satisfying. I don't know that they should, because how is anybody going to follow that chart if they don't know the answer to that question, right? But many times the autistic client may be the one who is asking the question that other people are thinking but not saying, right?
Mhm.
So, and it's also really important, to validate by, really like validating all those questions and just kind of doing your best to answer them. So I'm going to stop there because I'm mindful of time. And I think that brings us to Charlie's going to introduce the next point.
The next point is that I mentioned before that people with autism have gotten used to a strategy in life that may have started very early in life as children, if they were feeling like certain things weren't acceptable about their behavior or they were treated in certain ways, that they learn how to mask some of their features of being autistic, some of the ways they have of thinking, maybe even some of the ways they have of asking questions, some overt behaviors that people have made fun of or made comments about, and all kinds of things. So masking seems to come up everywhere you read about autism, and it's come up with Amara and Rachel a number of times. So I wonder if you can speak to, in doing skills training, you don't want to add to masking. You want to help people feel affirmed and comfortable in learning skills and in using skills. So what are there certain traps? I think it's Rachel put it this way, masking traps, like traps when you're teaching skills where masking becomes particularly relevant to know about and to do something about. So Rachel, I'll hand it over to you.
I mean, we all mask. I mean, that's the long and short of it. Everyone has the experience of masking something or certain parts about ourselves. And with autistic masking, it is the experience of subconsciously, consciously, or unconsciously, like intentionally hiding these autistic features for the purpose of fitting in, not seeming weird, different, etc. And I think the key piece here is that it's done out of shame. It's done out of shame and the need to be accepted. These masking is taught to us when we're little, have quiet hands. If I'm needing to shake my hands to regulate my emotions, right? And I'm being told quiet hands, it is that much harder and it's more likely that I'm going to have a meltdown later, right? So when we see these traits as lesser than, unacceptable, essentially wrong, and how we show up to the world, basically. And so when we use that neurodiversity lens and we reframe autistic traits as an element of diversity rather than being lesser than, that's what we're doing. And the problem is that there's times where autistic traits, features, the way the person shows up to the world in their, utmost comfort is not necessarily the most effective option in getting to their goal. So I utilize the term, I use mindful masking. Now it's not the greatest, because if I'm saying masking comes out of shame, and is this reclaim, is it just the best I got right now? But there's certain skills where therapists fall into what I call masking traps, where they're teaching a skill that encourages masking and actually perpetuates the shame. So when I teach this, I'm actually encouraging them to use that more mindful masking approach. So kind of coming in with curiosity, that we can, it's possibly a place where we're being mindful of spoons, of the amount of energy it takes to mask. What we're not saying is fake it till you make it. We are not saying that, because oftentimes autistic folks are never going to make it. And if you mask too long, it leads to burnout, right? But for just this, we're explaining it to clients, for this instance, if you show up, if you operate in this way that doesn't feel natural to you, knowing what your goal is, you can use the energy and effort to do this little uncomfortable thing to get to your goal quicker, or you can not do this and just see how much that is going to take from you. And as long as we're introducing this as a choice, as a difference rather than the way you should, that's the difference between encouraging masking, or that therapist getting trapped into teaching a masking behavior, which DBT has been accused of many times. So like I pulled a couple really good, what I feel are good examples. I can't go through all the masking traps, but the first one is this idea of appearing confident, interpersonal effectiveness, your dear man skill, the A, because my version of looking confident, or when I'm confident, what you're going to see on me may be different than someone else, like this eye contact, this physical stature. It's all really holistic in nature. And it's also true when an autistic person is under duress, it can seemingly regress, kind of take on a younger tone of voice, mannerisms, act younger than they are because of the level of anxiety and stress. It's not necessarily a choice, right? That is the nervous system taking over and the brain protecting itself. So that being said, we're having these honest conversations with our client of how do we be effective? And maybe this is a conversation better had over text message or email, or maybe we teach them, you rehearse this until it's like a script, until you're like on stage. If that's going to be most effective, knowing that it isn't the natural state of being. And then we have this kind of expectation, societal expectation that responses must be instant, yes or no. And people are conditioned to say yes or no. And then if you don't, if you say yes and then you don't do it, it's kind of a fawn response initially. If you're saying no, it's considered oppositional defiance. And yet the person really needs that processing time. So we get really used to, I have clients practice the script of, hold on, I need some time to process. Let me get back to you on that, especially as we move into that negotiation scale, especially as this instant back and forth is expected. And it may not be the type of thing where a hyper-connected brain that takes a minute to process can produce. So it's another way that we kind of approach the dear man skill. There's the distress tolerance skill, the willfulness. This is a huge one. I really, really caution therapists to be extremely, extremely careful with this skill because we really portray willfulness as a choice. On our handout, we say we're using to tolerate, giving up, attachment to me. And, autistic clients who have these differences have a lot of them are accused of being selfish, and it's a lot of shame, right? And me, that's selfish. I can't be in a room because the noise is too loud. That's selfish. I am prioritizing my needs over other people's, and yet, I physically can't exist because that's pain, and these things are incredibly shame-inducing. And so when we have this willfulness or willingness skill, it kind of fails to account for this incredibly complex process, nervous system dysregulation, that can create a willfulness or what could be perceived as in any client, much less an autistic client. So when working with willingness versus willfulness, I really, really encourage the therapist to do this deep dive into this behavioral investigation with the client. I have this expanded missing link analysis I work with. We really want to get to the clients to come to that conclusion of willfulness on their own. And, if we are going to introduce it, kind of introducing it tentatively, there is this one thing, could it be there's an element of willfulness going on here? Just in a very tentative way. So we're not re-traumatizing with, you are this thing, and now the client is shamed again. And then the last of the traps that I kind of wanted to talk a little bit about is the check the facts that Amara referred to, because similar to other marginalized groups, as therapists, we really need to act with enough neurohumility to understand that our view of reality is just inherently different from that of our clients, even if we share some intersectionality and some identity pieces. With checking the facts, we're really assisting our clients in looking for judgments. And when a client identifies something as a fact, we just need to believe them and really help them operate effectively rather than challenging their perception of reality, because a lot of autistic folks are really, really good at seeing patterns. And sometimes we're not always so great in communicating those patterns effectively. So the facts are still there. It's just putting words and articulating them is the issue. And so if we're validating the client as they express things and helping them operate effectively in the context of, it can be a lot less traumatizing than just saying, no, you're wrong. That didn't happen. Did you actually see that? There's a lot of others, but I'm gonna pause there because.
Wow, another great answer. So much detail. And Amara, was there anything you wanted to add to that, or are you ready to move on?
I'm just being mindful of time. I think that was great. Thank you, Rachel, for bringing up all those really important things.
Yeah, you've definitely highlighted, both of you have, you've probably changed my practice in the last few weeks in a number, just heightened my awareness, and maybe not just with autistic folks, but really how many different ways there are of people coming to grips with reality, and that people have different neurotypes. So really being asking myself over and over again, wait a minute, well, maybe this person needs to do it this way. Maybe this person needs to not speak right now. Or maybe this person needs to move around. Or maybe this person needs to use some behaviors to calm down. Or it's just sort of like opens the door to an enormous range of human potential and human styles. And so I think it's a big topic, and I really appreciate what you guys are saying. Now, the next topic is related to this because it's kind of like in how many ways it's possible for therapists and skills trainers to unintentionally invalidate people with autistic or ADHD neurotypes, like all these ways that we end up pathologizing people for their characteristics. And so I just wonder if you could say something about approaches that therapists and skills trainers can take to be alert to this possibility of invalidating autistic folks, and how to and if there's certain skills around which invalidation is more likely to come up. If you could say something about that.
Absolutely. So I also just want to say that, like, Charlie, what you were saying about being aware that there could be different neurotypes, different interpretations, different realities. I think that adapting DBT to better serve autistic clients and ADHD clients is very, in my mind, closely connected to adapting DBT to better serve various diverse populations, right? There's been a lot of discussion about that for BIPOC populations and others. And I think some of the same types of difficulties, like the difficulties with checking the facts and not making our assumptions about our reality as the therapist, not assuming that that is the same as the client's reality, I think it's all part of the same, kind of thing, right? It's all part of this kind of humility about my experience is my experience. I need to like really be curious about this other person's, lived experience and life experiences, and, not making assumptions. So I think it just falls into that. And I think this question about unintentional invalidation, it's definitely something that can easily happen with autistic clients. And it's also something that I hear often can happen with other diverse clients who may have life experiences that are different and or even values and goals that are different than the therapists, right? And we want to make sure that we're centering the client's reality and not the therapist's reality, because it's of course easier to center our own reality, but it might not work for clients who are different. So I think in terms of avoiding unintentional invalidation, how do we make sure that, of course, as DBT therapists, we care so much about being validating, right? We have a whole set of theories, the biosocial model, about how harmful invalidation can be. And, we don't want to perpetuate that in therapy. And we work all really hard, so many levels of validation to try to be validating. So I just really want to acknowledge those fabulous intentions, and make some suggestions about how, to make sure to be validating for autistic clients. So I think in pre-treatment, Charlie hinted to this earlier, but in terms of goal setting, that getting rid of or reducing autism is not the goal. That is invalidating in and of itself. And so let's make sure that the goals are truly the clients and not just shoulds from other people. And autistic clients have been receiving, honestly, lots of shoulds from other people throughout their lives. And some of that may be initially brought into the room. And of course, we want to honor what autistic clients are saying, and also have our little radar up for if it sounds like they're just kind of repeating a criticism from somebody else, and maybe it's not their goal, like just kind of being curious about that with them and helping them with, discernment of what they really want, and being really validating of that, which may be a very foreign experience for them if the other people, both personally and professionally in their lives, have been pressing them toward conformity with, non-autistic norms. That whole, it may be a very, very new experience to have somebody who's truly validating what they need. I would also say one way to avoid unintentional invalidation is what we call kind of, as Rachel was saying, neurohumility, or also radical authenticity, just like being willing as the therapist to not know, and, to be wrong. And, you can say things like, hey, this is a trick I learned when I was an academic, because you give a talk and usually your biggest fear is somebody's going to ask some question from left field that you don't know the answer to. And, I had to learn to say, hey, gosh, that is a great question. Like, I don't even know the answer, but thank you for raising that. I will totally look into it. Right. And then I realized that this the skill for, honoring and, colleagues is also really good for honoring clients, right? Like, clients come in with questions that you don't realize they're going to have, right? And we want to treat them with the same amount of respect that we would to, a colleague, right? And so, there's nothing wrong and nothing shameful about not knowing the answer all the time. And, you can be really validating when you don't know. I would say also, I said earlier, really encouraging answering to the best of your knowledge, or at least validating and reinforcing all questions, right? Don't pathologize question answering, right? Curiosity is, and this is one of my values. I think curiosity is a good thing, right? Being, having lots of questions is a good thing. And many autistic people have been pathologized for that, throughout their lives by many people, not by all people. I know some of the most formative people in my life have been the people who encourage those questions. And, don't we all want to be that wonderful, person in our clients' lives, to be really validating to them and helping them, really believe in themselves and, be curious and grow, right? I would say in terms of specifics, just places where we could be invalidating and ways to not be. In distress tolerance, there's a page about adapting DBT for addictions, where it says, are there any of these things that you do like over and over again, and you've tried to cut down on them, but you haven't been able to? And that seems like a little bit of a risky one for autistic clients, because autistic people tend to have very passionate interests and hobbies and things like that. And many have been told by other people that they should cut down on those things. And they have maybe even been subject to interventions to try to cut down on those things. And they may not be able to, because guess what? They need those things, right? These are our special interests, right? So I think we want to be careful with autistic clients that handout, which has a different intention, doesn't doesn't pathologize spins, which are actually a really, really important thing for autistic people, right? And I think that theoretically, I think, well, is this something that you've been trying to cut down on because other people are giving you flack about it, versus something you're trying to cut down on because it's actually harmful? I think that's a big difference in terms of differentiating, like, am I accidentally pathologizing sort of a passion or a spin, versus is it something that actually is, an addictive problem for this person, to which these addiction skills might actually apply. I think in emotion regulation, there's a page about emotion myths, and I'm not going to go through all of those, but I just say be careful not to invalidate the valid, right? We learn with validation that we need to validate the valid, but let's make sure not to invalidate, a reality or even a value system that might be valid, right? Because it's different than ours, right? There's some neurotypical, or at least non-autistic assumptions in some of those emotion myths. In terms of emotion regulation, accumulating positive emotions in the short term, I think this is an issue that I deal with for all clients, but just there's a sort of generic list that's provided to give some ideas, but be aware that, like, the events, not all events on that list may be pleasant for all people. Some of those options may be very unpleasant for some people, right? So make sure that whatever the whole point of the skill, and I think this speaks to Charlie's kind of, theoretical conceptual approach to DBT, right? The whole point of accumulating positive emotions is to do things that you enjoy, right? Not to do things that somebody else enjoys or that you might not enjoy. So I think with that skill, just make sure that clients are choosing things that are pleasant for them, and also make sure that you're not, maybe organizing something is pleasant for them. And maybe that's not something as the therapist that you would find pleasant, but maybe that actually brings them a lot of joy, right? So just make sure you're really validating whatever it is that they find pleasant, even if it's not something that you would find pleasant or that the manual says is pleasant. Accumulating positive emotions in the long term, there's this wonderful values and priorities list. I think that is a great tool. It sort of comes from kind of the ACT world. Great tool to help people really get in touch with what they want. And I know a lot of people run into, when they first go through it, kind of shoulds, right? We come up with shoulds, like, oh, values are like, but that's kind of a loaded term that can have kind of cultural, like, should kind of implications. And I think we can help when we introduce that to say, this is really about what you want. And you may notice, your mom's voice popping up in your head, or your, ex's voice popping up, or your boss's voice popping up in your head saying, or your, church's voice popping up saying what you should want. But this list is actually about what you actually want, right? So just be aware that voice could be popping up, those shoulds could be popping up, but that's not what this is about, right? So this could be a super validating thing, but it can also be an invalidating thing if the client's bringing in shame. They're afraid, well, maybe you have the same kind of value system as all these other people whose shoulds I have in my head, right? And so I'm giving the correct masked answers rather than my actual real answers, right? Like we have to be really intentional about creating a safe space for them to be able to be honest about what they actually want, because that may have been judged very heavily in the past. Coping ahead, I think we need to make sure that, and this is again emotion regulation, making sure that the coping ahead plan is realistic based on clients' needs and abilities or disabilities. It's easy for people to kind of make I'll just do this. And I think, all as DBT therapists, we've probably all seen somebody initially make a really unrealistic coping plan, but just be aware that, autistic clients have been being told by other people for a long, long time that they should be able to do X, Y, or Z that may not be realistic for them. And so I always ask kind of like, okay, well, how is that actually happening? How would you do that? Like, and is there going to be anything that gets in the way of that? And, just kind of being really curious with them and making sure that the plan is realistic. I see Rachel raising a finger,
Yeah.
so go for it,
I just
Rachel.
wanted to insert here, this is a place also where unintentional invalidation, when we are doing interpersonal effectiveness with the Dear Man and writing a script, there's so often this debate of, if a client asks for help writing a Dear script, do we assist them in providing the words, or do we encourage them to do it on their own? And it's very true that there's a lot of folks who may always need assistance in actually taking in hearing the words, something to make their own versus generating it themselves. And so as therapists, that when a client says, please help me write this,
Right.
that you actually can provide words for some folks, because they may not actually be able to generate it on their own. Or if they do, the weight on them of how much that script took to produce is so much heavier than if you had assisted them by providing words. So I just wanted to jump in there with that, because that really generated that one.
That's a great point. And I do think it brings up, one of the things that can be invalidating is the, societal assumption that everybody should be, this is a very Western society assumption that everybody should be perfectly independent. People should leave DBT being able to do all of these skills like perfectly independently without anybody helping them. And I don't think that's realistic for a lot of clients, but certainly for a lot of autistic clients, they may continue to need the person who did my autism, diagnosed me with autism as an adult. I really appreciated that she said, hey, you know what, you have a system of other people that you can ask when you don't know how to handle a social situation, or you don't know how something you say might land. And that's awesome. Like, that's completely valid to need, right? That's not like something you have to make a goal of getting rid of, because if your brain just isn't on the same wavelength as other people, being able to reach out to other people and ask for help, and have those other kind of wing people in your life who support you is not a bad thing. It's a perfectly valid thing, right? And so I think we don't want to imply that perfect individual independence is necessarily always the appropriate goal for everyone. I think I just want to say one or two things about interpersonal effectiveness. This is a place where I think, because there can be masking traps, and also because of unintentional invalidation, where DBT has gotten a bad rep among some people, autistic people, who have seen it as kind of just enforcing and teaching neurotypical norms. And so I think we want to be I think the interpersonal effectiveness skills can be incredibly helpful, used mindfully for autistic people to work towards some goals. I personally found just the step-by-step Dear Man so amazing when I first was learning how to teach that. I was like, wow, there's like a logical way to do this stuff. So I would say just be aware some of the myths in interpersonal effectiveness may not be myths for some autistic clients. And so I'm just going to leave that at that. And then also hand out 20 behavioral strategies, maybe trauma triggers for some autistic clients who've been forced into ABA earlier in their lives. And I don't want to, ABA is a whole different discussion, but I just want to say that those can land really negatively, and you might want to be really cautious about those for autistic clients. And they can also feel really manipulative in a way that feels actually really kind of unethical to some autistic clients. So I'd say you can present them as an option, but also be aware that there may be valid reasons why people are not into them. So I'm going to stop there.
Thank you. Thank you again. I've found you guys make such helpful comments. I've raised 2 boys with ADHD, and I'm thinking back on things where I unintentionally invalidated them and where they could have used kind of more of this kind of understanding. So thanks. And let me say now the next one comes out of I'll just to make a very concrete example that brings to mind the next thing. When I teach DBT skills, or when I teach chain analysis, or when I teach anything where I'm trying to show people something, DBT can be so heavily verbal that I sometimes think DBT is like doing therapy above the neck, and doing therapy in the verbal world. And the verbal world is not everything. And so the question is, are there strategies? Because, when you do a chain analysis, you can also represent it visually, and you can make it into a flow chart, and you can have your client participate with you with their own magic marker when you're making, and turn it into a sort of project together. And there's lots of things that can be like that I think we don't think enough about. And so in particular with people with autism, I wonder if you guys could comment about, are there sort of adjunctive or augmentary strategies you can use to sort of help people understand things when straight verbal discussion is just not doing it?
Yeah, I'm going to speak briefly to that. So thank you, Charlie. So I think we want to be prepared. Like you said, the handouts and workbook is very verbal, right? Therapy in general relies heavily on intense back and forth verbal communication. And there may be differences in communication and learning needs with autistic clients. So, Rachel already spoke to, taking longer to respond, or, maybe needing to process out loud. Also consider adding illustrative visuals for clients who would benefit, kind of making spreading things across sort of the verbal and more visual. Charlie gave the great example of doing chain analysis, visually, and there's a lot of different creative and very visual ways that can be done, very participatory. So definitely a fan of that. Also just things like simple graphs or flowcharts showing relationships between variables, or change in emotional arousal over time when using skills. There are a few in the manual. There's like the Wise Mind Venn diagram, which I think is actually a nice example. And others have been sort of created and shared by DBT therapists who are trying to help their clients better. I want to thank Lori Ritchell and the people at UNC Teach, who've been one of the things that they have suggested is using more visuals with autistic clients. And I appreciate them suggesting that. It's something well known in terms of improving teaching for autistic students, and helping with self-regulation, giving kids like lists of visual lists of things and that sort of thing. I think there's a lot more work to be done in terms of developing visuals that resonate with autistic clients, and of course the same visual is not going to resonate with every autistic client. Colleague Melinda Brackett's been doing a lot of work on developing visuals for autistic clients. But again, I think I would love to see more kind of, crowdsourcing of this and having people develop and share visuals. I'm personally not great at developing visuals. I do use an example of like with turning the mind, kind of, and when you first turn the mind, it's like a like walking across a grassy field and there's barely a track that you can even see, and it gets, you know, eventually more and more worn and more obvious and easier to do, and then the old path kind of gets neglected and overgrown. So, you know, I'll use examples like that, but I think maybe there's probably many people out there who've thought of a few interesting visual ways to explain things or illustrate things, and I'd love to see people sharing those things, because I think it's a lot, just because the standard assumption in therapy and in the manual is highly verbal. So I'm going to leave it at that. Hand it over to Charlie and Rachel for the next point.
Yeah, so let me say about that, and do a shout out to one thing that when you say about adding the visuals, is that many people know about this, but maybe not everybody, that there is a place that you can go into a search engine or into YouTube and type in DBT-RU, which stands for Rutgers University. And DBT-RU, my colleague Shireen Rizvi and her colleagues and students there have been now for quite a while putting skills out in 3 and 4 and 7 and 8 minute clips that have an illustration. They have a very talented person who does animation there, and so they have these cool little animations and clear explanations that are very specific about the skills. So people can access the skills there, and it can augment other skills training. I use it myself with many of my clients. So I would just want to add that there.
I love that. We use those almost every group.
You do.
We use those specific animations when we're introducing skills. I oftentimes pause because I have to reframe some things to make them a little more neurodiversity affirmative. And, you know, I know they're taking straight out of the manual, and my clients love them, or the feedback I've gotten at least is that they're super receptive to them.
Yeah, same for me. Hey, look, we're going to do one more main topic here, which is such an important topic because as you guys have made perfectly clear in this and previous podcasts, people with autism often have heightened differences in how they register things in their sensory experience. So heightened experiences of sound or light or fabric or touch or smells or tastes, all kinds of things. There's just sort of a heightened and differences that compared to neurotype ways of experiencing sensory, though I'm not even sure what those are, since there's so many different ways. But I wonder if you could comment a little about, given the sensory experiences that people with autism sometimes have, what would you highlight about teaching skills that to keep this in mind? And what do you have to adapt, and where might you run into trouble? So I'll just hand this over to either of you. This will be our final topic for a few minutes here.
So with sensory, I want to explain it's not just heightened. There's also hyposensitivity. So we almost need more input to feel anything. And I think it's really important to keep both in our minds as we're working with clients. And it's also really important to introduce the 8 sensory systems, not just the 5 that we've talked about a little bit in previous podcasts. Because if I have a hyposensitive interoceptive system, so knowing what's going on inside of me, and I can't quite tell I'm hungry, but I'm super dysregulated and I don't know why, it could be, and in knowing that about myself, that I'm hungry and not realizing it. I really, really love giving the clients this youfeelllikeshit.com that somebody sent out on the DBT listserv, because it literally will run people through have you had something to drink today? Have you taken your medicine? Are you hungry? And it really is very clear in the directives. Okay, go get a snack. Or is it too cold or warm? Are you able to adjust the temperature? So it cues those conversations, almost links in the chain, or the missing link of why am I dysregulated? So it's almost like a regulation missing link analysis, if you will. But hypersensitivity really needs to be taken into account when we are going through those chain analysis, especially when it comes to things like self-injurious behavior. We're discussing distraction, self-soothing techniques, because like if an autistic client goes, oh no, and they're frustrated, they smack themselves in the head, right? We don't pathologize that generally. And if there's an autistic client who has low interoceptive sensitivities or awareness that hits himself in the head and it causes a mark, we as therapists may see that differently. Or if a client likes to self-soothe by taking a hot shower, and then they're burning their skin because they're not registering the burn. Well, what I'm not saying is we should accept and encourage these behaviors because this, I'm guessing our clients are not having a goal of harming themselves. And yet I really want to encourage people to think about kind of working with the client about the reasons why it's happening this way, understanding just beyond the self-injurious behavior. That we're doing our chain analysis and really bringing up this knowledge, knowing this, having this awareness of sensory differences is imperative as we're helping our clients. And the implications are really just to be mindful. I've spoken at length previously and then on our listserv about adding the S to the please scale to optimize emotion regulation, reducing vulnerability to emotion mind. We really need to be balancing our sensory input. So if a client's kind of stuck and they may be unconsciously like stifling a movement, a stim, they may not even know they're doing it because of masking for so long. In distress tolerance, in self-soothe, we are teaching our clients to stim. We are teaching them to use their sensory systems, all of our clients, to regulate their emotions. Using the give me one more second. I'm going to kind of skip this. I do want to do like a shout out using these extra 3 sensory systems: distraction, self-soothing, emotion regulation. So the interoceptive system, the vestibular system, the proprioceptive system, we can sometimes substitute a behavior to the one that was causing harm that may be actually serving a regulating purpose. So this is where I want to shout out to my colleague. His name is Cade Sharp. He works with kids and adolescents in Washington State. And he's really the one that brought to my awareness that when he works with somebody who bangs their head, because it is helping regulate them at that time, he just suggests gently to, why don't you try turning yourself upside down? Because he has found, and the clients have found, that the vestibular input of inverting the head, like laying on the edge of a bed and sticking your head over, causes a similar regulation response to this other need that is more self-harming. So we're working with the client's urges rather than against them directly, especially because head banging can be so shaming for folks to talk about, because it is that regulation need, and yet it is a form of what we consider self-injurious behavior. So when we're teaching these skills from our proprioceptive system, that's knowing where our body is in space. We can teach movement. We can teach, how to upregulate or downregulate, crossing the midline of the body. Kind of, if our brain is not sure where our body is in space, using things like weighted blankets, compressing clothing to regulate in that way, or the opposite, if we're feeling kind of constricted, seeing if maybe it's that we need to change our clothing. Vestibular system, using things like spinning, rocking. Go ahead, Amara.
I just wanted to throw in that a lot of what Rachel's talking about is for children. There are a lot of occupational therapists who provide sensory integration type of services, and that can include things like, developing sensory alternatives, what we call sensory diets, which is kind of a proactive like sensory input plan as an alternative to, harmful or otherwise problematic, sensory seeking behaviors. It is hard for adults to find occupational therapists who do that with adults. So that might be something you find yourself kind of called to do. But if anybody wants to learn more about this, searching for sensory integration, sensory processing might be things you can learn about. I'm not suggesting you step into the domain of OTs, but it is hard for adults to find OTs who know how to work on this, whereas there's actually quite a few who do it with children. So,
yeah. Right. And there's a couple of them here in Maryland that I've connected with. We're fabulous, but really kind of what we're doing in teaching self-soothing, using the senses, teaching even using strong sensations to help ground. We really are teaching use of those sensory systems And so, collaborating with those OTs, we can take our cues from the kid, child, and adolescent OTs as well, because what's helping a kid can also help adults. It just depends on how it's presented.
Tell you, there's the richness of this. I think you guys, since you live in this world and you focus on this world, I think you may underestimate how many things you've covered that'll be new to other people, or that people maybe have just thought a little about and you're expanding a little bit. I mean, and so I thank you for covering, and I know you've had to cover things quickly, and I know you have a lot more to say. And if people want to reach out to you guys, I know you both consult to other people about using DBT and other models with autism and ADHD. So you guys can reach out to them. You can come through my website if you want to leave an email, and I can put you in touch with them, and they can answer questions as long as they don't get flooded with too many at once. And I'll let them handle their own limits about that. And I want to say, Rachel, that was so interesting what your colleague said about putting your head down, because I not too long ago, my wife was going through vertigo, which is a terrible syndrome to go through. It really throws you. And this is a standard approach to vertigo, is you lie there, and there's various maneuvers with vertigo to try to help interrupting vertigo, and which is basically a dysregulation of the vestibular apparatus that you have inside you, one of your 8 sensory systems. And so, you just look everywhere you look, you see possible adaptations that are already naturally existing in the world. You just don't think of them as what you would incorporate in skills training. But that's so cool. And take kids, if you look at 6 kids lined up at a gymnastics studio and they're waiting to jump on the trampoline, and one of those kids is actually bouncing around and the others are standing still, you just figure that kid bouncing around shouldn't be pathologized. That they're doing what they need to do, actually, in order to wait in line, which other people can stand still in line. Not everybody can stand. So it's like there's so many examples of this to look around if you open your mind in a non-judgmental way and just affirm that people are doing what they need to do and try to make it adaptive rather than to try to correct people and get people to stop doing stuff. So hey, you guys have just, I think, opened a whole vein of possibilities here. So thank you so much. Because now
Thank you, Charlie, for having us.
Yeah, you're totally welcome. It just was great. I want to do one shout out here at the end is to, I want to thank, as I've done before, NEA BPD supports and sponsors this podcast. You can get to them at borderlinepersonalitydisorder.org, and they have a fabulous website with lots of learning resources and about borderline personality disorder, about DBT and other models of treatment. And they have an annual workshop coming up that was hosted for years and years and years by our esteemed colleague, Seth Axelrod, who passed away last year. And Seth was on this podcast 4 times talking about his experiences with cancer. And so they have their annual Yale NEA BPD conference on May 5th, which is a Friday. You can either go virtually or you can go in person. So it's a hybrid conference this year focused on attachment and trauma, and it's always really good. So I just wanted to mention that in case you listen to this podcast before May 5th, which is coming up pretty quick. And you can go to NEA BPD's website to find out more about registering for that conference. So thanks very much to Rachel and to Amara. I've really enjoyed this. I really appreciate your input. And I'll let you know anything that I hear from other people. I'll pass it on to you.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Charlie. Thank you for having us and allowing our voices to be heard. And absolutely, if people want to write, I'd be happy to respond. I'm assuming, Amara, you're in the same boat.
Yeah.
Because it's clearly something that's very important
to
both of us, and
It's important to a lot of people. You're going to have a lot of fans in Sweden. I think I passed on an email that my dear friend Anna Lindstrom, who is one of the senior people in DBT in Sweden for a long time now, wrote and said, "Oh my God, she loves these podcasts you guys have been doing." And she said she's going to be sending it out to the whole Swedish DBT community because people are always asking what to do about autism. So, I'm sure Sweden's not alone. This is just some place I happen to have a connection. So prepare yourselves. Study your languages. You know.
Okay.
Okay, we're going to end. We could talk on and on, but we're going to stop now. So thank you everybody for tuning in. Bye-bye.